So, hello and welcome to the Filmwerkstatt Düsseldorf. I'm very happy and excited that we get the chance to talk to Joshua Oppenheimer tonight. He's in Copenhagen right now and connected via Skype, as you can see. And yeah, we have a beautiful large projection of you, and everything seems to be working fine. Before we start, I would like to thank Katrin Tiedemann, the director of the FFT, who is cooperating in this with us and also helping to finance this, so thank you very much for that. And then I would like to introduce my fellow panelists. Start with SYLVIA BAHL. SYLVIA BAHL is a research associate at the Institute for Media and Cultural Studies at University Düsseldorf, and currently working on a PhD project on reenactment and transitional justice aesthetics of working through. Welcome, Sylvia. And Reinhold Görling, he's professor for media and cultural studies at the University of Düsseldorf since 2002. He taught comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine, the University Innsbruck, and the University Hanover. And his last book was Scenes of Violence, Torture and Film from Rossellini to Bigelow. Welcome, Görling. They are both working currently on a book with the title, it's a very long title, The Obscene as Political Performative, Political Strategies of Provocation and Utilization of Effects. So I would like to hand over to Sylvia now. She will introduce Joshua in a few words.
Okay. It is a very special feeling and an honor for us to have this opportunity tonight for a conversation with Joshua Oppenheimer, whom I actually don't really need to introduce to most of you, because his works are already part of our scholarly curriculum every semester and lead to profound changes of perspective and lively discussions every time. Still, I would like to highlight some moments of his career for our audience here. What really intrigued me, Joshua, were your initial academic studies of theoretical physics and cosmology at Harvard University, that you started with a manner that became characteristic and distinguishing for your later artistic work, wishing to understand what we are. This profound openness is always connected to some kind of fearlessness, which I really admire. You were born in the United States of America in Austin, Texas, and already in your early film works, also at Harvard, you examined the political situation around you very closely. And part of it was the rise of certain right-wing militia and neo-fascist groups in the 90s, within which you entered with a very peculiar hidden identity to document at close range something like the phantasms, the fears, and the inner contradictions of those movements, which is something that becomes hauntingly urgent today when we take a look at the presidency of Donald Trump. In these short films, it was fascinating to see how you and your collaborator Christine Sin worked with the density and intensity of images in their surreality that really challenged and extend the terms and definition of documentary itself. In 2001, you first came to Indonesia with a group of researchers and activists to initiate a participatory project on the dimensions and consequences of globalization. You once mentioned that the destination came up merely by chance because it could have been many other places in the global south. This already implicated the systemic relation of violence, exceeding the local and specific, but the findings and conclusions of your team, shooting and performing the globalization tapes in 2003, point much further than that. Many of us are quite aware of the junta crimes in Latin America, but the mass violence in the South Pacific was nearly unknown to us, especially in the dimensions of impunity that creates a very singular political situation. With your films The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, you and your team reacted to that in a way that opens up a whole new level of historiography and documentary art altogether. A manner of working through that is aware of the performative dimensions of violence and histories of violence. There's a strong capacity for empathy and an openness for the other that is exactly required, I think, to grasp the cruelty and to address the obscene acts of perpetration, which is what you do and which keeps us intriguing every time we see this film again and again. To propose this as a question of anthropology, in fact, as an investigation in what a man can do to a fellow human being, in the best and in the worst sense, is that what we all increasingly need to discuss, we think, to understand how the global conditions of violence affect us all and require a response and a collective responsibility. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussions we can have with you tonight, and maybe you could start a little with telling us a bit more about how you got involved into the work in Indonesia, and how did you get in contact with the people in Sumatra, the workers, but also the perpetrators, and how and at what time exactly did you realize there was a genocide in 1965?
Well, so first of all, thank you so much for that very generous and thoughtful introduction. And you alluded to my working on a project that led to a film called The Globalization Tapes. In 2001, Christine, Seine, and I were asked if we would basically run a 6-month film workshop somewhere in the world, somewhere in the global south, for workers who were struggling to organize a union and who faced challenges in organizing a union that had to do with mass violence, and where there were connections between that mass violence and globalization. And I understood they considered sending us, this was a project of the International Union of Food and Agricultural Workers, which is a union of agricultural workers based in Geneva. So if you're a member of a German food workers union, you would then be affiliated through that union to the International Union of Food and Agricultural Workers. And they considered sending us to Colombia, to Bangladesh, to Indonesia, to Moldova. And in the end, they sent us to Indonesia to work on a very remote Belgian-owned oil palm plantation where the workers were struggling in Sumatra, where the workers were struggling to organize a union in the aftermath of the Suharto dictatorship. And there was a very short time between the decision to send us there and the first visit there. So we really knew nothing about Indonesia when we made that trip. And when we arrived, we found ourselves on this Belgian-owned plantation where the women were dying in their 40s because they had the supposedly easy job of spraying the pesticides and the herbicides. And we sat down and talked about what are the biggest problems they face as workers. Clearly this was the biggest problem. And then when we returned soon after that to begin this 6-month period in which they would make the globalization tapes, one of the first things they tried to do was to demand protective clothing from the Belgian company. And the company responded by hiring this strange paramilitary group that wore orange and black camouflage called Pancasila Youth to threaten and actually beat up some of the workers. And the plantation workers simply immediately dropped their demands, saying to us, well, although this is indeed a matter of life and death for us, you see there was a mass killing here in 1965, which led to the Suharto dictatorship. And this organization, this paramilitary group, was the main organization to carry out the killings on behalf of the army. And they're more powerful than ever, and we fear that if we pursue this, they will start killing us again, effectively. And I understood at this point that these women who were already, some of the women we were working with were already getting sick from liver problems, that they would actually sicken and die. And what would kill them was not only poison, but also fear. And we spent the next months talking about that fear, and they made this film. But at the end, they said, why don't you come back, as it was time for us to leave, and now make a film yourselves that would be too dangerous for us to make, about why after 35, 40 years we're still afraid. And I guess I was 27 years old, and at that age I couldn't look away. So this was how I came to understand, to know that there was a genocide, and also there was a genocide where in some crucial and terrible respect the perpetrators were still in power.
The women in the globalization tapes you show, do you still have contact with them, or do you know if they are still alive? I mean, it just was so piercing to see them do this parody of a commercial clip, and it was heartbreaking in a way.
Her name was SYLVIA, and she actually died the day that I flew from Los Angeles to Telluride for the world premiere of the act of killing. I got the call in the airport.
Okay, and, so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so it's 5 years ago now. And she was already quite ill when we made it, so she actually survived a fairly long time, but that was 11 years. She died at about, I think it was 51, so she was 40 when we made the film, and she died at 51. But anyways, when we returned, they said come back right away as quickly as you can, and come back and make this film that we cannot make, and we returned as quickly as we could, and and actually this is the same plantation where we would go on to make The Look of Silence, the second of my two films. And when we returned, immediately the people who with whom we lived and made globalization tapes said, you have to meet, if you're now here to look at the source of our fear, the 1965 killings, you have to meet this one family, the family of Ramli. Because Ramli's name had become on that plantation, and maybe for a 30-kilometer radius, a kind of synonym for the genocide as a whole. You see, tens of thousands of people had been killed at the various rivers across North Sumatra and had simply disappeared. They'd been taken from prisons in the dead of night and never heard from again. But Ramli escaped while he was being killed, or escaped from the bus from which he was, where he was being taken, on which he was being taken to be killed. He escaped, was caught and killed, but the ultimate murder had witnesses, and a body was found in the plantation. And so his death was undeniable. So you have this situation where a mass killing has haunted an entire community. It's traumatized an entire community. The dead are unburied. The survivors are not even allowed to talk about the dead, and they're not even allowed to really mourn their loss publicly. And at the same time, the perpetrators are in power to be able to say this happened. Ramli is proof that this happened. Became, I think, terribly important, and so gradually over the decades, his name had become synonymous with the killings. And so we were immediately introduced to his family. And then they immediately introduced me to their youngest son, who was born after the killings, after Ramli was murdered, and whom Ramli's mother, Rohani, felt was a kind of reincarnation of Ramli. She said she was able to continue living because she had Adi. And Adi, she said, Adi was a kind of, she said Adi looks like Ramli, talks like Ramli, acts like Ramli, you must meet him. She called Adi to the village, and Adi latched on to the idea of making a film and really made it his own, and started gathering other survivors to tell us their stories. This was now in April, I think, 2003. And after 3 weeks of that, the army came and threatened all of them not to participate in the film, and actually arrested us briefly. And we were preparing to give up at that point. We had a meeting at midnight in Adi's family's house, Ramli's family's house, and expecting just to meet Ramli's family, but all 30 some survivors we'd met over the previous few weeks were there at midnight, and they sort of sitting in before us saying, you mustn't give up. You're here, you speak the language. If you cannot film us, film the perpetrators. And that struck me as a kind of crazy and dangerous idea. I thought the perpetrators would simply deny, for the most part, what the survivors were saying. But I had filmed one perpetrator who you'll remember is actually in the globalization tapes. And he was sort of boastful in front of his granddaughter. And so I thought maybe there's something to this, maybe they will. And after all, they were saying the perpetrators had been boasting about what they'd done to the survivors for decades, basically to intimidate the survivors into silence, to keep them afraid. So I sort of said yes with real trepidation. And then they introduced me, starting from that one perpetrator, they introduced me to others. And all of them were boastful, all of them were open, all of them who were still healthy enough would say pretty much right away, why don't I show you where we did the killings and how I did the killings? And they would launch into these kind of spontaneous demonstrations of how they killed. And I suddenly realized, and then after I felt compelled to film every perpetrator I could find, because no one had documented the killings in this region at all. So I would just ask each one to introduce me to every living death squad member of their own death squad, and every commander they knew, every other death squad commander they knew, and I just filmed killer after killer after killer. For the first year, 9 months, for the first 9 months, I filmed them alone. And then but they were all boastful, and at some point I felt I had to understand, are they boasting only for me? Is it because I'm foreign and I have a camera? I sort of knew the answer because I'd seen them boast in front of their children and grandchildren. But I just had to know, is this something, would they speak in the same way in front of each other? So I took this risk in January 2004, where I brought two perpetrators together who'd never met each other before, Inong and Amir Hassan, and they brought me to the Snake River, where they helped kill 10,500 people in one spot. And that's a scene that the material from that day of shooting has come several times in the Book of Silence. They take me down to the river, taking turns playing victim and perpetrator, trying to outdo one another in their boastfulness, trying to claim ever greater responsibility for for the killings, and trying to show as graphically as they could what happened. And I realized that I had this sort of awful realization that this is not a sign of that if these men are mad, if there's insanity here, if there's evil here, it's collective madness and collective evil, it's political, it's social, that they're reading from a shared script. This is an acceptable, socially acceptable way of talking, at least in their milieu, and it performs a function. And I went home that night and scribbled in my notebook that they're totally traumatized, really upset. It was a horrible evening. And I went home and scribbled in the notebook that I keep while I'm shooting that there should be 2 films. One should be about the boasting of the perpetrators, and the other should be about what is it like for survivors to be forced to live in silence in the shadow of that boasting. And I guess those 2 films I knew would require utterly different methods, because they're looking at totally different things. They're both about, it's important to say neither of them is about the 1965 genocide as such. Both of them are about impunity today. But they're about 2 different things. The first one, I knew that the boasting was somehow, I had the sense that the perpetrators aren't really trying to remember in detail what happened when they take me to a place. It's not that they're lying, but they were performing. And performance is always intended for a victim. That's right, for an audience. Yeah. I guess I felt that they're victims.
Yes,
yeah. Well, in their case, their audience, for the most part, was the community of survivors, who they were boastfully intimidating. But it's intended for an audience, and the question for me was, who is their imagined audience? How do they want to see themselves? How do they want the public to see them? How do they want the world to see them through my camera? How do they want their fellow Indonesians to see them? How do they want their grandchildren to see them? And how do they want to see themselves? And how do they really see themselves? In all that chatter and gesticulating and sort of lurid description, what silence are they trying to make impossible? What self-reflection are they trying to make impossible? So I continued maybe I filmed another 10 perpetrators before I started to propose to them. I mean, by then, I've maybe filmed 10, now is another 10, so it's like maybe number 20, I don't know. But I started to propose to them, look, you've participated in one of the biggest killings in human history. I want to know what it means to you and what it means to your society. You want to show me what you've done. So show me what you've done in whatever way you wish. And I'll film whatever dramatizations you'd like to create. But I'll also film you and your fellow Death Squad veterans discussing what you want to show, and just as importantly, what you don't want to show. And in this way, I can sort of show, and I don't quite know why they agreed to the second point. Because if I have them talking what they don't want to show, in a sense, they're admitting things they don't want to talk about. But somehow they agreed. And they understood, and I said this was an experimental method, and this is what led to the methods in the act of killing. Now, I never expected that there would be these sort of surreal, genre-inspired dramatizations. That only came about when I met Anwar Congo, who was the 41st perpetrator that I filmed. And that was already now in July 2005, so more than 2 years into this process. And I did something, and there were two things that led to the way the act of killing developed. First of all, Anwar had this, and as did all the important perpetrator Death Squad leaders and Death Squad members in the city of Medan, a city about the size of, I don't know, maybe Berlin or Chicago. It's a big city. But all the Death Squad members there had been recruited from the ranks of these movie theater gangsters who had this love affair with Hollywood movies. But second, so when you ask them how do you want to dramatize what you've done or stage what you've done or reenact what you've done, they would sort of inevitably, it was not a big leap for them to choose a genre. But more importantly, Anwar was unique in that he couldn't quite hide his pain. He couldn't quite hide his doubt. And so the very first day I met him is the day at the beginning, was this day that he took me to the roof where he killed hundreds of people and showed how he killed, and then wanted to dance in the place that he killed. It's this scene at the very beginning of the act of killing. It was the first day I met him. He says, if I think about this too much, I'll go crazy. And after he showed me how he killed, and he said, if I think about this too much, I'll go crazy, and to forget what I've done, I've spent my life going on drinking, taking drugs, dancing, and look, I'm a good dancer. And then, as though to banish the pain that he just felt while demonstrating how he killed, he started dancing. And I realized this is just like the surreal boasting that I'd spent 2 years filming, except it's defensive. He's not celebrating what he's done, he's running away from pain. And that made me think I should show him this footage, which was a scary thing to do, a risky thing to do, because he could say this makes me look bad and call the police or the military. So I showed him the footage with my whole crew at the airport with our bags packed, ready to evacuate if we didn't get a message saying everything was okay. He looked, when I screened, and it's the first scene in the act of killing where, and if you've seen the full version, the 2.5-hour version of the act of killing, which is one on DVD in Germany, if you've seen that, he, over the course of the film, has many screenings, but this is the first one. And he looks very disturbed. I was certain watching him that he's going to say, stop, why am I doing this film? I don't want to participate, and then call the police. But to do that would involve admitting, to say even that he looks bad would involve somehow admitting that it was bad. Because all he's doing is telling what he did, and he's never been forced to do that. So instead of saying this was bad, he lies to himself and to me and says the problem was his acting and his costumes and the setting.
The white jeans.
Yeah, and proposes the white clothes. He says he looks like he's dressed for a picnic, and he proposes a better mise en scène. And I agreed to shoot the next scene not because I was interested in kind of starting a psychodrama with it, but I knew it would be more absurd, and if he would bring in his other more outrageous, and if he would bring in his more people to stage it, it would provide a greater understanding of impunity, of how the perpetrators are together and lie and talk with each other. So I agreed, and then I just kept repeating that process and showed in that scene, and the scenes gradually became more and more surreal and each scene increasingly became a kind of reaction to the previous scene. So he would shoot one scene in, for example, a waterfall scene where he staged this ridiculous false redemption of heaven, and he'd watch it and he'd be delighted, but then it would feel fake. And so then he'd have an urge to show me something more authentic, and he would sort of to confess it to me, to show me the worst of what he's done, knowing that this was a lie, the waterfall's a lie, me in heaven is a lie, so let me show you the worst of what I've done, in the hope that I would still see him as a human being, and that would then offer him some comfort. Because of course, his biggest fear is that if he really looks at the worst of what he's done, he can't see himself as a human being anymore. So I showed him, so I would allow him to shoot that scene, and then he'd watch that, and then he'd swing the other way, and think he needs something lighter to run away from that pain. And we just kept doing that and doing that until it was a kind of journey through his own experience of guilt and denial and guilt and denial, until it became more and more painful and erupts in despair and some visceral physical form of regret that he's too afraid to even put words to, but that's where the film ends. And so the act of killing became this kind of phantasmagoric fever dream, because it's ultimately a film about escapism, fantasy, and guilt. And I knew the look of silence would require totally different methods. I knew that it had to be just as experimental in a way, because it had to make visible this very delicate thing. What does fear do to a family over 50 years? What does silence do to a family over 50 years? How can you make visible the experience of living surrounded by ghosts because the dead haven't been buried, and you haven't even been allowed to visit the grave of your son, which is only a kilometer from your house, because if you do so, you know you're going to get arrested, and your other children will be tortured or even killed. And that involved trying to find a way of making visible, the traces of fear, a wrinkle in Rohani, Adi's mother's brow, which is just from a lifetime of unmourned loss. And the way I didn't know that we would confront the perpetrators with that, but when we finished shooting The Act of Killing in 2010, I gave Adi a small camera to use as a notebook to look for images that might inspire the making of the second film. And I had to go back and edit. That took 2 years because there was so much material. And Adi was sending me tapes, and when I returned to shoot, I would watch them and think about them. And when I returned to shoot The Look of Silence, Adi said, I've spent 7 years, from 2003 to 2010, watching your material with the perpetrators. It's changed me. And I need to see if the perpetrators can take responsibility for their action, because only in that way will we be able to live together. I need to meet them, I need to confront them, because only if I know that they can take responsibility for their actions can I feel like I'm living amongst human beings and not monsters. And immediately I said, no way. I said, there's absolutely no way we'll go and film the perpetrators together, because it's dangerous. There's never been a film where survivors are confronting perpetrators while the perpetrators are still in power, ever, because it's a stupid thing to do. But Adi said, let me show you something. And he went and he got this camera I gave him in one tape, put the tape in the camera and pressed play, and showed me the only scene in the finished film, The Look of Silence, that Adi actually shot himself. And that's the scene of his father crawling through the house at the end, calling out for help. And Adi started to cry the moment it was on the screen, and I just watched it thinking, why is he showing me this, and what is this? And afterwards he said, it was a family reunion. That day I brought the camera just to make a home movie. This was the first day my father couldn't remember anybody in the family. And he was raving, terrified, because he thought he was in a stranger's home and would be beaten up, and we had to take turns keeping an eye on him. And it was terrible because we couldn't comfort him. When we tried to comfort him, he thought we were there to attack him, and he would just get afraid. So it was awful. At some point, it was Adi's turn to keep an eye on him, and Adi had the camera with him so his children wouldn't break it. And he just felt terrible not being able to help his father, just watching him scream and cry out. And so at some point he said, keep an eye on his father to make sure he wouldn't knock something over and hurt himself. but also to sort of concentrate on something else, he decided he would practice filming. And he said it didn't offer him, he said it turned on the camera, hoping it would make it better, but it didn't offer any comfort, because the moment he turned it on, he realized that he was witnessing the day in his father's life that it became too late to heal. Because his father's forgotten the son whose murder destroyed his life and his family's life, but he hasn't forgotten the fear. So now he'll never be able to work through it. He'll never be able to heal. He'll never be able to accept it. He'll die trapped in this kind of prison of fear, like millions of other survivors. And Adi said, if I can't establish a humane relationship with the people who killed Ramli, then my children will inherit this prison of fear from my parents and from me, because they'll grow up living surrounded by people who were afraid of and who exploit us because they know them, that we're afraid of them. So I was very moved. I went and I talked to my crew, and my crew said, you know, Adi wants to confront people who are locally and regionally powerful, but not nationally powerful. And you're now well known. The act of killing hadn't come out yet. That's very important. I knew that once the act of killing came out, I wouldn't be able to return to Indonesia safely at all, but at least not for a long time. But the act of killing, the production of the act of killing was well known in that region, and especially in the perpetrator's community. You'll recall in the act of killing, there's a TV show celebrating the shooting of the film while we were still shooting. So he said, you know, the people Adi wants to confront know that you're close to the most powerful people in the country, and they won't dare detain you, let alone physically attack you, because they won't want to offend their superiors. So the fact that you've made the act of killing has created this unprecedented condition where you can do this if you wish. So we took lots of precautions, like having a getaway car and having for Adi and for his family with their bags packed at the airport, ready to evacuate also if anything went wrong, and many other precautions like that. And I told Adi, maybe we can do this. We have to do a kind of test confrontation with someone who doesn't know who you are, so your family can see what it is and whether they can agree to this. And that's the very first one with Eno, the man with the red glasses, where he's testing the glasses. Adi doesn't say who he is. And he said, but you also have to be prepared that we shoot this and we may never be able to release this film, or at least not until these people have died or until there's political change. But if you're willing to take those risks, we can try and shoot this. But I have to also warn you one last thing. I don't think we'll succeed in getting the apology that you're hoping for. I said, I think we'll come into those people's houses, you'll look at them with this humanizing, gentle gaze. They'll look back at you as a human being. We then had the idea that he could establish empathy by testing their eyes and intimacy. And then they'll see you as their doctor, maybe even. They'll see you as a human being. And the moment they see that they find out you're Ramli's brother, they'll realize that Ramli was a human being too. And they spent their whole lives trying to deny the humanity of their victims. And they'll panic and they'll get angry and they'll threaten us. But if we can show that moment of failure with precision and empathy, we can make visible the fear and the abyss dividing everybody, and how torn the social fabric is, and how urgently truth and reconciliation and justice are needed. So that's how that method became the core of Code of Silence.
Perhaps what you said gives the impression that it was a very unique situation for both of the films, and a very unique kind of method. But how far can we learn about this in a more general way? The look of the act of killing is made in great parts in this rhythm of dramatization, of screening, of re-dramatization again and again. And this gives this film a very, very special kind of aesthetic, and you even bring it, I think, to us as spectators of the film, that we get involved in this process. And but what you said now it is a very special situation with Anwar that he was that he participated in this process. How far can one generalize this method, this aesthetical way to get to a documentary?
I think that I think there's just two thoughts that I would have. One is that it's that every time one is the more general point, which is that every time we point a camera at anybody, they start acting out an idealized image of themselves, that they an image, a self that they wish they were, and that it's self-consciousness, to be sure. And most documentary filmmakers try to get past that self-consciousness as quickly as possible. Many despairingly and artlessly order their subjects to act normal. And they end up getting some kind of simulation of normal life, quote-unquote normal life, as if there were not a camera present. And the question is, how insightful is that? How insightful is it when you simulate your ordinary life? First of all, you no longer offer authentic moments where you're open or vulnerable or pushed beyond your comfort zone, because instead you think, oh, I'll show something typical. And the typical is the kind of postcard view of a place, right? It's not authentic, it's typical, and it's not enlightening, except insofar as it says something about the presenter's imagination, their generic imagination. So I think it's interesting that I think that in a sense, by asking people to stage themselves in whatever way they wish, and then to show them that, and then to see how their self-understanding changes, it either becomes defensive or they cling to another notion of themselves if they're running away from something, or they embrace something, or they grow. That's in a sense, I think, the state of nature, or it should be the state of nature of nonfiction filmmaking. Because the very first thing that happens if I film a human being is they act. And what are those scripts and why? I mean, the same question I made in the specific context of boastful perpetrators can be applied to anybody. For who is your imagined audience? How do you see yourself? How do you want to see yourself? How do you really see yourself? And it's that gap between the self and the mask, the performance, that this filmmaking method explores. And of course, that method becomes dramatic in any context where there's self-deception. And we all, about any aspect of our lives, many aspects of our lives, not just moral aspects, we deceive ourselves all the time. We live as though we're not mortal. We live as though each day is not precious because it's the only time you'll ever live that day. And we're in denial of that because that's a frightening thought. So there's self-deception about big existential questions, and then of course there's the self-deception we all have because we're complicit. We all know we're complicit in the suffering of others in myriad ways that are uncomfortable to explore. So I think it is generalizable. And of course, one last thing, which is that sometimes people point to, and I try, that especially sometimes in Germany, people have asked, well, could such a film have been made in Germany? And I just always stress that the method as deployed in the act of killing is really an exploration of impunity. What happens when perpetrators win? And that doesn't make it special and specific. It actually makes it all too and frighteningly universal, because perpetrators normally win. In genocide, people commit genocide because normally they get away with it. There's a few sort of extreme examples where perpetrators of genocide have been overthrown, but as in Germany. But even then, how many Nazis were really held to account? As few as possible. As few as possible.
There's this short sequence in Claude Lanzmann's Shoah where he secretly films the perpetrator and he's boasting too, but with restrictions, because he knows that he can be punished, but still you have a glimpse of that boastfulness, which is very frightening. And
well, I also think, I do want to say something about boasting and its defensiveness, because you know, I think every perpetrator that I've filmed lives their life in a kind of manic flight from a cloud of guilt and shame that follows them everywhere they go. And by day, most of the time they can outrun it, but at night when they stop to sleep, it gets into their dreams and gives them, they gnash their teeth, they cry, you know, it gives them headaches, it gives them terrible nightmares. And but what do they do? In the case of Indonesia, they have available, because they're still in power, they have available to themselves a victor's history that celebrates what they've done. So they do what anyone would do. They take their most bitter, rotten memories, the most grisly details, and they try to sugarcoat them in a heroic tone and in heroic language, so that those memories become easier to swallow, so they don't choke on them. And I think in the act of killing, we simply showed the sugarcoating for what it was, and in the end, Anwar's choking on his memories. But the Landsman example is really interesting, because I find always that man was he's from Treblinka, right? Yeah. He's, I'm trying to remember his name. Okay, he sort of acts apologetic, he acts sorry, in a sense. He sort of acts like, oh, it was a terrible shame, yes, it was awful. And we can read it as an insincerity. He's not, and we can read his anger at Landsman as proof that he actually is a die-hard Nazi and he thinks what he did was right. But I would submit that we should read it in exactly the opposite way. There's no way that he could possibly sit there. And I mean, the Nazis have been removed from power, and he doesn't have a glorious language that he can cling to. So he has to say he's sorry, or he has to repeat that it was terrible. But if he were to be fully present and sincere, if he were able to, in that admission of guilt, he'd fall apart, he'd dissolve, he'd be undone. And I think my reading of that scene has always been that he's detached, he's dissociated from the language of guilt, not because he doesn't feel guilty, but because he feels guilty. Or because he's so undone that he's beyond feeling guilty, he's numb, and has to be numb, so that he can live with it. And then the anger that erupts isn't because you know, secretly he's a Nazi all along. It's because it's exactly what happens when Ali confronts the Pope Inong or Amir Hassan's family, or Amir Siahaan, or the perpetrators in the Look of Silence. They see their defense mechanism crumble. They see that they've been caught out, and then they have to glimpse, at least, the abyss that lies in front of them, in which they wouldn't be able to live, and I think then they get angry. But it's a self-protective anger, and it's also actually a sign of guilt.
Yes, I'd like to ask, I mean, what's so fascinating to me, maybe to all of us, about the act of killing is that we witness all these transformation processes that are going on, like how they shape their identities, how they test them, what you have described already, and how they evaluate them and change them, and how they're kind of looking into the camera and looking also for a way out in terms of how can they live with what sort of identity would that be possible. And I would like to know, how did you work with this situation on the set? You were saying that Anwar was proposing a lot of scenes, like fantasies he had, or like cinematic scenes that he would like to shoot for himself. How did that work?
Well, Anwar would propose. Anwar would propose an idea. For example, Anwar had this experience of. Well, first of all, I just want to make a point that I think our capacity for evil depends on our ability to lie to ourselves. But I think that you need more than one lie. If you have one great lie that says you participated in the glorious extermination of the Jews or the communists or whatever the lie may be, and it was heroic and it saved the nation, that's not sufficient, because it'll feel fake. You'll sense it's a lie. You'll know it's a lie because you're lying to yourself. You'll know it's a lie. and it won't contain your guilt. So you need another lie, which is inconsistent with that you can sort of jump to. And here my theoretical physics background provides me with a metaphor, like an electron jumping instantly from one quantum state to another. It's completely different. You need to jump to another lie and inhabit that for a while. And when that becomes uncomfortable, you jump back. So Anwar, as we were developing, Anwar would propose, first of all, a genre, or a so-called improvement in a scene. So one of the early ones, so from the first scene on the roof, we went to this scene where he has a bright pink cowboy hat in this, actually the same room, the same space, where then we did then he saw that, and he's like, oh, the space is great, but it should be lit more like Scarface. And then we had to determine, does he mean the Al Pacino Scarface, or does he mean the Paul Mooney, Howard Hawks Scarface from the 30s? And he then meant that. We showed it both. He said, oh no, right, that's the one I mean. So we had to make it look like sort of film noir with low-key lighting for him and help find the costumes. And then he would direct scenarios, and gradually, and what he was doing there was embracing, well, first I think he was sort of distancing himself from what he was doing by saying he was acting, it was cool, it was glamorous, like a film noir anti-hero. But that then led him, but then he was never happy with the way his friends would play the victim. So at some point he wanted to play the victim. And that led him into a kind of trapdoor. I think there was actually an earlier trapdoor where he butchers the teddy bear, which was really one of the worst things I've ever seen, where he sort of despairingly falls into this into an encounter with the worst of what he's done, his worst fears about himself. And it makes him angry, and it makes him despairing. That's his defense against his anger. His guilt is anger and despair, and he sort of throws himself sadistically into the worst of what he's done, to his worst. And he sort of, as if to say, like, it was awful, but at least it's glamorous, or at least it's cool. I don't even think it's glamorous anymore in his mind. And then he watches that, and it makes him feel ill. I mean, I'm not talking about the end of the film where he's choking, but it makes him really upset. And I remember then he said to me, oh, I used to, he talked about having nightmares as a result, because I think he knew the nightmares stemmed from this. And then he talked about a cleansing that he did in a mountain stream where like a holy man had bathed him in flowers in this mountain stream. And I said, maybe, and I said, what do you want to, what are you thinking about that? And he said, well, I'm thinking maybe we could recreate that to show the ups and downs of my life, how I feel really, I get nightmares from this, and then I cleanse myself this way. And he starts to embrace this kind of nonsense religious version of Anwar, which he's never been religious. He's been a thug and a drug dealer and a pimp his whole life, and an assassin. So suddenly he has this kind of religious alter ego that he decides to stage, and then it's like, then it just gets more and more elaborate. So we look at some kind of cleansing scene from, I don't know, the Ten Commandments, or Moses being put in the bulrushes, and that wasn't big, grand enough. And so gradually it grew into the Waterfall musical number, with Born Free being sung by the angels, and then his victim giving him a medal and thanking him for sending him to heaven. And then, but he really loved that. And then when he shooting a musical number is rather technical, so he didn't encounter much difficult feeling along the way. It was, shooting, there's playback of music, and we're in a huge waterfall, so we're shouting through bullhorns as you hear in the opening of the film. And but then when he watched it, you see this thing where he said, I never knew that I could make something so beautiful. The depth of emotion is so, it expresses such deep emotion. But he knows he's lying. And so this is an example of like the lie wearing off. It doesn't fit. It no longer provides solace because the sweetness is saccharine. It has a bitter aftertaste or something. So then he says, let me see the scene where I play the victim. Like he knows he needs to confront the truth, to see if he can cope with it better or something. And then that, of course, and he knows it's going to be hard, so he gets his grandchildren in to sort of be human shields in a way, to protect him. I guess my point is that there was this, between this, both in the screenings and in the planning of the scenes, there was this flip-flopping back and forth between alternate self-forms narratives of self-deception. And then, because it was a big deal for us to set up any one of these scenes, we would try and come up with, Anwar and I would try and come up with as many sort of scenes that we could shoot on that set as possible. And each set was designed to reveal something new, either about Anwar, or in the case of the big one, the ones done in the TV studio where Adi is present, Adi Zulkadri is present, was about how does he talk with the younger generation of perpetrators. And of course that was also the core, the initial idea for the massacre of Kampung Kolam, where we built a whole little village, and he brought all of his friends and fellow death squad leaders and their fellow paramilitary leaders, and then they brought their children and grandchildren. And I just made one rule, which was if you want to tell your kids or your grandchildren about what this scene is about, what this scene is really about, that this is a dramatization of a pogrom that you actually committed. You must not do that on the set. It's because every parent here will have their own sense of when they should tell their children. And that's not for one purpose. This shooting should not make that decision for anybody. So we auditioned the kids for who was able to cry on command, and we put those kids in front of the camera, and the ones who were laughing are further back. But something very strange happened where the wives of the death squad leaders used this opportunity, or maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously, to show, I think, what I only understand as the trauma of living your whole life with someone you know is a mass murderer and never being able to name that. So there's this one moment after when they shoot the massacre, and there's kids who are crying. Okay, those kids are crying because they knew that it was time to cry. That was the task. But there's a woman who looks really disturbed. They treat her as though she's possessed. And she looks like she's fainted. But I think it's a kind of expression, an acknowledgement before her husband that maybe it was cathartic, maybe not, but it was a kind of acknowledgement of the trauma that comes with living your whole life with someone you know is a killer and has killed all these people. And we would spend days on those bigger sets, like 5 days on the film noir set, 3 days, because it was expensive when we built that set, when we built the village, because we had to bus in all the paramilitary leaders, and none of them worked for free. Anwar and the others would, but not them.
I would be interested in that moments of surreality you create in your films, and how they become a scenic constellation throughout the whole film, especially as a logic of the dream. There's an incredibly strong image at the beginning and the end of the act of killing, the fish, which has probably many layers. I would really enjoy hearing a little bit more from you. There's also another strong visual theme, which is, of course, the wire, with which Anwar and the other perpetrators try to kill in a more humane way. And that comes up again and again in different forms. For example, the fishing line, the lasso of the cowboy, and later even the medal you already mentioned, that the victim is hanging on the neck of Anwar, who already put the wire of the killings on his neck a little bit earlier before. And there's this grotesque plastic fish singing "Don't worry, be happy." That seems to embody the uncanny zone between life and death, in a way. The dancing women becoming the fish with fins, a little bit.
Mermaid costumes, yeah.
And of course the devouring scenes of cannibalism and being engulfed by the flames. So this whole theme of enmeshment, I would like to ask you, would you say that the fish could be read as a non-resolvable enmeshment between victim and perpetrator, like the killing of the animal with a wire and still fearing to be devoured by it all the time? This unresolvable connection you have when you kill somebody that keeps haunting you.
I'm delighted that you have given such thought to it. I'm honored by it. When you make there's a fantastic sentence in the Quran, the Holy Quran, which says, the world is full of signs, and all you have to do is to learn how to read them. And I think that's really the task of a filmmaker, not just a documentary filmmaker, but now I'm working on a fiction project, and my imagination is really about organizing your memory into metaphors. And I think that you look for metaphors as you shoot, and sometimes you stumble across them, like the fish that sings "Don't Worry, Be Happy." That was just something that this guy had in his house. I knew it sang because I recognized it from the world. I mean, I've seen those before. And I said, "Oh, would you sing?" I knew what it sang. It sings, "Take me to the river," which actually has a resonance here, because they threw all the people in the river, but also "Don't Worry, Be Happy," which I think has a greater resonance, and is certainly more closer to Anwar's genre. So I just asked him, "Would you play the fish for me?" And shot it in a way this is going to be potentially an important metaphor. And how do I frame it so that it becomes a kind of tableau? And what does it mean to make for a metaphor to exist in cinema? It has to somehow stand out. I think the easiest way to do that is with time. Let it outstay its welcome. Give it a distance that is sort of not a medium shot, but sort of something that makes you look at it as a thing. And so that you start to wonder, what is this? And why is it here? But if it had an answer, had with any certainty an answer as concrete as what you said about the bigger fish, or the fish symbol in general, it ceases to be a metaphor and starts to be a symbol. And I think it's an interesting, and I'm looking for these all the time, with the jumping beans and the look of silence, with the way as I mentioned earlier, the eye tests for Adi, that began as a kind of, that was simply a practical thing. Adi, they knew me, but they didn't know Adi. Adi would have to get them to open up to him about all the things that they told me 7 years earlier, so that he would not have to confront them with my old footage, which would of course make them feel trapped and angry. So we thought, okay, if you test their eyes, it creates intimacy, it creates rapport. It's also something Adi could concentrate on when they say something that disturbs him, so he wouldn't get angry or get upset. And also he could prolong it. He could continue it for as long as necessary until all of the important information that he needed to have a basis for confronting them had come out. So it had its practical purpose. But then the moment I saw the red lenses on Enon's eyes and his twitching cheeks, in a medium shot probably, I thought, oh, this is a metaphor for blindness, for willful blindness, for willful moral blindness. Or it could be, if it survives into the film. So immediately I readjust the cameras, one into a real close-up, frontal on him, so that his twitching face becomes a landscape and a tableau, and in that sense you find your metaphor, and then you nurture it, the way you do a seedling in a garden that you think is going to grow into something precious, and you give it enough water, and you shelter it from too direct sun and wind, and you take care of it in every stage of the shooting and in the editing and you'll have editors and people and producers who will say, I don't understand that, what is it? It's just a shot of a fish. And you say, no, this is the most important thing in the movie. And so then I just want to finally say something about the fish, and which is that, Anwar, we shot 2 musical numbers. One was the Born Free at the Waterfall, which we've discussed. The other one was based on Peggy Lee's song, Is That All There Is? Which is a song about disappointment in life. And we were driving looking for locations, Anwar and me, and we came around a bend along in a mountain road, and there was this enormous concrete fish. And if you have any talent at all as a filmmaker, in such a moment you pull over.
Yeah.
You don't drive past it, even if you think, oh, my film is about genocide, this fish is irrelevant. You are not a filmmaker or an artist of any sort if you continue past that fish. And so we pulled over, and Anwar said, oh, this fish used to be a seafood restaurant. It went downhill in the Asian economic crisis. It's so sad, it's so disappointing. And I heard the word disappointment, and I said, how would it be as a location for Is That All There Is? Which is this musical song, this song about disappointment. And he said, wonderful. And then we started staging the musical number there, and we shot it. And then I looked at the material, and I realized there were these images that were so exquisitely beautiful. There's the opening, but there's my favorite ones come in the middle of the film where Herman's singing, sitting in a bright pink dress, cleaning his ear, and starts singing this song about going to the movies on a Saturday night. He sings a song about the movie theater gangsters, which is what Ammar had been. And the closing image, and I thought these images somehow embody the whole sense of this film. If it's a musical number, if it was a musical film, which I think of The Act of Killing, at least in its longer version, the director's cut, I think of it as a musical, it would be the opening number of a musical should embody the themes of the whole film. And I thought this does. There's this like beautiful, this decay, here's this glimmering, shimmering, beautiful mistake, catastrophe that just remains. It doesn't go anywhere. The fish isn't going to go anywhere. It's stuck there. It's concrete. And when I was editing, I realized either we could cut together his musical number and have two musical numbers in the film, or I can use these tableaus from the fish. And I knew I couldn't do either, because once you see the musical number, I couldn't do both, rather, because I knew once you see the musical number, it takes away the mystery of the fish. You know why they're there. So I knew that, faced with the choice of either keeping some of these images that embody everything the film's about in some mysterious way that I can't explain as eloquently as you did, or having another funny, strange musical number, it's obvious you choose the former. And then the last thing to say about the fish, which is so important to me but not in the film, is that the lake behind the fish is called Lake Toba, and it was formed 75,000 years ago when an asteroid, I'm wrong. It was formed 75,000 years ago when a supervolcano erupted, causing a volcanic winter that precipitated such terrible weather for so many years that the human species basically went extinct. There were millions of human beings all over the planet. And if you look at the fossil record, people disappeared pretty much everywhere, and then gradually reappeared as they spread out. And the only way to account for this, and there's a thin layer of ash right where that catastrophe happened, and that's known as the Toba super catastrophe. It's also known as the Toba bottleneck, where the human species, we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years, went through a bottleneck. A disaster reduced our numbers to just somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 people living somewhere. And then from that group, we regenerated. You can tell that by looking at the DNA of everyone on Earth. We're too closely related for there to be 700,000 years of evolution between us. So in that sense, when they're dancing in that very final shot with the thunderstorm in the background, they really are dancing, for me, at the very edge of the abyss.
Concerning the editing, maybe another question. You sometimes talk about excavating as a method, and is there anything you discovered really in the editing process that, you have very many people involved in your team, many cameramen as far as I know, and you have created an amount of material that is incredible, with which I also asked myself, what will become of the rest? Will there be something like a living archive in Indonesia? Will it be available to the people? Will there be legal consequences for the testimonies the perpetrator gave on it? As far as okay, so sorry. Please.
No, that's enough questions. I see that the editing is really a continuation of the discovery that you're making. That I see filmmaking or documentary filmmaking as posing a set of questions and then finding means to excavate, to answer those questions, in cinematic terms, by inventing methods. So you find the questions, you have some characters, and then with those characters, you create methods that will help you understand answer those questions. And you continue working and evolving those methods as your questions generate follow-on questions, and you get deeper and deeper answers, and you keep going, shooting until you start to realize you can't go deeper with these kind of methods, and you start to just move sideways to new sets of questions. And that would be a new film. And then at that point you move into the editing, and I see the editing as a process exactly of excavating all the layers of meaning in the footage, and I deliberately, when I stage a scene, try and over-determine the footage, give it multiple layers of meaning. So you have a simple example from the act of killing of Adi and Anwar discussing about morality and its moral relativism, while they're getting the atrocities that they inflicted on their victims on their face, and then if you know the film really well, you realize that they're actually being dressed up like the victims, like victims of communist atrocity that we see in the anti-communist propaganda film that they're also discussing in this scene. But these are layers that I put in the footage that I don't know how they work. And then in the editing, you're excavating those layers, you're figuring out how those layers can work together, and you're also discovering the language for how this some tension that should define the viewer's experience. In the act of killing, it's a tension between empathy and repulsion and horror, and you find that you're discovering, and that discovery is not about telling a story yet. It's about understanding the nature of what you've been through with these people, what they've been through with you. And then somewhere when you have a first assembly of the film, first rough cut of the film, you start to become a storyteller and think, how can I translate all of that wisdom or insight that I've had through the years of editing into a single experience for a viewer that's more that is a kind of condensation of all that I've learned in one. How can I take someone through this material that gives them that insight? And then finally, your question about the archive, there's 1,200 hours of material we're starting to work with the Shoah Foundation to set up an oral history project around this material, but also around the gathering of new material and bringing together of all archives around the 1965 genocide in one place so they can be used by school children all over Indonesia, but also around the world. In Indonesian schools, that's a big deal because teachers have had to, the Indonesian History Teachers Union has had to create an alternative history curriculum to show, perhaps illegally, the Look of Silence in both films in high schools. So they teach, this is what we're supposed to teach you now, and now this is the truth. And then so there's been, it's another question that it touches on, but the impact of the films in Indonesia has, you could say, sort of transformed the way the country talks about its past, and there's also sadly been a pushback from the military where you get the military, the commander of the Indonesian Armed Forces just this week issued a command to the head of the army, the head of the navy, the head of the air force to try and limit screenings of the Look of Silence, which of course meant that the viewing on YouTube of the film, we put the films online for free in Indonesia, and the viewings jumped up from 1,000 or 2,000 a day per film to 20 to 40,000 views per day per film. So this military order backfired, but there's a huge interest in what happened as Indonesians try and know their past and know themselves by knowing their past, and through that we're trying to support that by making all of the footage available for people to explore.
Perhaps may I address one of these layers of meaning you talk about, which, as far as I know, is rarely addressed, to explain why. Probably you know that this evening is part of a series of events about obscenity. We have organized together with Filmwerkstatt, Institute. And what I think is rarely, which really is a layer of meaning in both films, but it's rarely outspoken, is the strong interfusion between violence and sexuality, between violence you have a lot of elements. Cruel reports of cutting the body, the breasts, the penises. You have these grotesque dramatization where Aman stuffs a piece of meat into Anwar's mouth, saying that this was his penis, and you have these various other stories of anthropophagy, especially of drinking the blood. In a way, it is a very strong layer of meaning, as you said, but it is, I don't know, I have the impression that it's not directly addressed, that it keeps kind of off-scene, not of up-scene, but of off-scene. Is there a special reason for this? Perhaps should it have been another film to address this layer?
You know, I think there's... First of all, I think there's something unspeakable about some of the details that are mentioned. And I don't know how one can address it. And making the act of killing in particular, well, in both films, we really, ironically, surprisingly maybe if you've just seen the films and are disturbed by them, one of our main editing strategies was to cut away that stuff, because it was like we had mountains of horrific details and obscene details, and you've probably seen you've seen just the tip of the iceberg, and it's not that there's many worse things that you haven't seen, but it was in all the material. It was so prevalent in all the material, and we only used it I think in 3 ways. In the act of killing, we used it where we wanted to show somehow. You know, when I described the boasting of the perpetrators as defensive, and it's a sugarcoating of people's worst memories, this accounts for why they talk about the most grisly, obscene details. Instead of simply saying what I did was heroic, like Anwar does maybe at the waterfall scene. Because they're compelled to talk again and again about the most obscene details, because those are precisely the memories that are most difficult to swallow. Those are precisely the memories that they need to sugarcoat. At other times, in the act of killing, we would bring back, after a long stretch of absurdity, particularly focused around present-day political situation, we would include a moment that was obscene, in order to remind you of what this is really about. So there's this absurd stretch where they're preparing to burn down that village, dramatize the pogrom against Kampung Kolam, and there's the Deputy Minister of Youth and Sport, and there's Herman being rather funny as he tries to fire everybody up. But then we see Sapit Pardege talking about raping a 13-year-old girl. Yeah. And that's placed there to sort of remind you of the moral abyss that's going to be conjured in the dramatization that follows, and that's going to traumatize those women, or the woman who looks like she's fainted. And then in the look of silence, for example, one of the most beautiful things I've ever filmed, but also one of the most painful, is the scene where Ari meets an old perpetrator who's being taken care of by his daughter. Yeah. And the daughter, he tells horrible things about drinking blood, bringing the head of a Chinese person to a coffee shop. And she comes into that meeting saying she knows about what her father did, and she always thought of him as a hero. And then she hears these details, which maybe she's heard before, but she hears them through Adi's ears, and they take on a new meaning. And we really, basically, I didn't expect it. I don't think I even quite realized it while I was filming, because there was so much drama in that room, but in the editing it became very clear that this was her scene. As she realizes, she's the main character in that scene, as she realizes that her father, who she now has to continue to look after for the rest of his life, is in some terrible way a stranger. And she'll have to now still look after him. And Adi gives her way out and says, you know, no matter what he's done, he's still your father. And gives her permission somehow to still love him. And you couldn't tell that, unfortunately, I feel. I wish I could have told that without hearing about the drinking of the blood and the cutting off of the head. But that's what's impacting her. And if I'd written the scene, I wouldn't have put in that. I just think there's one more thing to say about the obscene, which is that it haunts. You know, I mean, these stories, I don't know if this is in the film, but the whispering of these stories has kept survivors in those villages terrified for 50 years. People go to the market, and you hear perpetrators saying within earshot of someone who they know as a survivor about some horrible thing they did to their relative, and that's deliberate. And that obscenity, I mean, obscenity I think has a kind of etymological sense of being literally off the scene, outside of the scene. It's something that haunts. It shouldn't be, I mean, it's funny, we think of obscene as the grotesque, right? It's grotesque, in-your-face thing, but I think actually obscene in English refers to something, actually, etymologically, it's that which haunts from the wings of the stage, that which you don't see but you maybe hear, that you feel. And that's literally how I've tried to use what you call the obscene, to sort of show, make the viewer understand, and also sometimes do for the viewer, exactly that kind of haunting. See how it haunts the daughter, see how it haunts, remind you of the horror with the drinking of the blood, with the raping of the 13-year-old girl. And one final thing is that there's this irony in Indonesian anti-communist propaganda, which is that the perpetrators, one of the ways that the propaganda makes them feel better about themselves is they basically imagine that their victims would have done, or they claim that their victims were part of a grand conspiracy that had on some small scale and would have on a much bigger scale done that which they did. So there's this story that these communist women had killed these generals by drinking their blood and cutting off their genitals, when in fact it was the perpetrators who were drinking blood and cutting off genitals. Yeah. And that sense of creating their victim in their own monstrous image through propaganda is really, really interesting, and that was really my thinking for those scenes where Herman is eating the liver and so forth, and they're responding to the anti-communist propaganda in those scenes that are kind of recreating it.
I would have one.
No, I mean, we have discussed a lot about the concepts of the obscene, and I mean, I think if I remember well, you used this concept to describe this propaganda movie where something is staged, but the meaning is not spoken out. That there's always in the obscenity some kind of this double. There's a denial and there's an exposure of a kind of transgression, and the parallel. So the anti-communist propaganda is not really saying the communists are bad. It's everyone knows everyone who matters politically in Indonesia knows there's no communists and there's no. There haven't been for 50 years. It continues to circulate. What it really is a veiled threat. Look how awful we can be. Look what we can do. It functions just like that reminder with the rape of the 13-year-old girl functions in the act of killing. Remember who we are. Remember what we can do. But they can't say that directly, or sometimes they do, in fact. Right?
But there's also this aspect of conjuring you already mentioned, and the way we can tell stories to ourselves we don't believe in, but still they become true to us in a way that is frightening. I mean, there's this as-if mode. When we go to the cinema, we have this experience of fiction and enjoy it, but the perpetrators, they create their fictional stories about spirits that hunt them, specters. They they feel attacked by, and then they get outrageous and kill people. I mean, what is this strange relation between fiction and reality in this practice of conjuring with words, conjuring with stories? Can you tell us a little bit more about? I mean, for example, in the graphic novel that I think Amir Hassan designed, there's also this genre you call sadis, which is special in Indonesia, a special genre of obscenity in a way, because it's strange to shoot a propaganda film like a slasher horror movie.
Yeah,
I mean, if you think of Riefenstahl, it's very different, very specific. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to imagine that the Nazis, I mean, many Riefenstahl's films were largely shot while the
I mean, they are obscene.
Nazis were consolidating their power, and consolidating their total control over society. But you have to imagine what might be produced 20 years after the Nazis won in 1965, if that was still the Third Reich, and how they might then encourage or allow aging SS officers to go back to their communities and boast, is if only to be sort of feared proxies of the state, right? But to keep other people in line, and then as a generation comes up that doesn't remember what happened, then you might produce something that serves to justify your rule, but also scare people. And that's what that propaganda is. I think it's interesting. I mean, I think, first of all, a lot of the perpetrators have, I don't think we actually had any real discussion of this in the films, but certainly I encountered it and I've written about it before. They talk about Romney being invincible, for example. He was supposed to be invincible. And there's no, meaning that he couldn't be, he was like, and also a great martial arts master. And if you stabbed him with a knife, you couldn't, he was invincible to knives. And if you ask his family, they'd say, of course, that's crazy. He was killed with knives. That's nonsense. But I think there's a need, at least retrospectively, but possibly immediately after killing people, to justify what you've done by conjuring, by imagining a resistance that wasn't there. And I think that's part of it. I think in general, you asked sort of very broadly and generally, what is the relationship between fiction and reality? Well, fiction is part of reality. Nothing we're doing would work without fiction. We subsist in fiction. What are we doing now? We're in Dusseldorf and I'm in Copenhagen and we're speaking to computers that are made in sweatshops in China, but it's just, you can't separate these things, and I think that's my main premise as a filmmaker, is to say, no honest documentary about reality can also avoid being somehow a documentary of the imagination.
We should now, maybe, because it's kind of late, it's really a pleasure to listen to you, but we should open the discussion, I think, for questions from the audience, to give them a chance to ask questions. Are there any questions?
Hello. Hello. Hi Joshua, thank you very much for being here. I watched The Act of Killing only once, 4.5 years ago, and I really love it. I came out of the cinema quite shocked. I still remember one scene in particular that for me it was very special because it kind of created, it's like a very small community, let's say, but for me this scene in particular made it like worldwide in a way. And it's when this guy, this fat guy, that he's like a horrible person, that he wants to become a politician, and he's watching this video of Obama giving a speech. And for me, this scene really triggered my imagination very much, because I started to compare this guy with Obama. Like, you are showing this guy how disgusting he is, and we can see it very clearly, and how he's learning from Obama how to become a politician, and he's kind of seeing him like a hero, and for me then I started thinking about Obama, how he works, and how many people he has killed, his regime, you know, like all the wars that he's doing. But I mean, he's one of the winners. He's a very smart guy. He can, many people love him, you know. So I don't know what you think about this, and yeah, I don't know how to explain it better.
I think, I mean, first of all, it was a very important strategy making the act of killing that America should sort of haunt the film in any way it could, and one thing I'm just guessing from the way you describe Herman, that you saw the shorter cut of the film, one of the shorter cuts of the film, because if you see the full film, 2 hour and 40-minute film, which I'm not sure you're from, but wherever it is, it's online, it's on DVD, or it's the version that's available now if it wasn't what was in the cinema. But it's, Herman really is strangely the conscience of the film in some crazy way. He's the kind of, he's a gangster like Anwar, but he's kind of also, I remember when Werner Herzog saw the film for the first time, he said, Herman's the goddess of revenge, the goddess of destiny. So I'd love you to see the film, the full version of the film, the uncut film, and you'll discover a new Herman. But I think that you also raise an important, I think there's all sorts of crazy irony in a man who's going into politics, actually for the reason that globally, right now, everybody who goes into politics, except in a few very privileged bubbles, to enrich themselves. That's why that is basically our global system now. It is like legalized plunder, or it's illegal plunder that's hidden offshore and therefore beyond the reach of the law. That's the system. That's now. That's what the world is now. And Herman goes in for these very simple reasons, and very, very normal reasons, and he loses because he's just not corrupt enough, actually. Anwar says, he says, you know, he's not big enough. He didn't have enough money to buy more votes. He couldn't, you know, when people ask for gifts, he has no money for them. Until after they win, which they're not, the voter, until after he wins, he promises money, which of course no one's buying. So, and then, but that someone so openly venal is admiring Obama, it took on, that scene really evolved for me over the course of Obama's presidency. At first, and we shot that in 2009, right after Obama came into the presidency. I was deeply moved that we had an African-American voter, we had an African-American president, we had this bright, progressive president. Then he said he wouldn't touch the torture stuff, which is ultimately actually why I made these two films. I saw the photographs that Amir Hassan and Inon are posing for at the end of the act of kill, at the end of the river in The Look of Silence, reminded me of the Abu Ghraib photos, giving the thumbs up and the V for victory, and I asked myself, in what moral vacuum, what present-day moral vacuum are these pictures being taken? And then Abu Ghraib, those pictures came out just 3 months later, and I remember thinking, this is how I can respond to Abu Ghraib, by making this film. And then Obama then came to presidency, didn't do anything about Abu Ghraib or torture in general. He ended the official torture policy, but has left it open to the next administration to resume it, which this administration now says they will. And then, meaning that we have impunity for torture in Indonesia, in the United States. And then, but of course in 2009, Indonesians loved Obama because he grew up in Indonesia. So for them, it's like the president of the United States is an Indonesian. And so it went from being this kind of grand irony, and then you have Herman imitating like a genuine progressive Democrat to, oh, actually, Obama maybe is, just as you said, much more complicit than we thought hoped he would be. And you know, I've often explained while I was releasing the act of killing, and Obama was still president, that, you know, for human beings to kill, we need some way of distancing ourselves from the act of killing. So Anwar needed movies and acting. The perpetrators of The Look of Silence, for the most part, just needed alcohol. so that they could get drunk before they killed. And when Obama would have these weekly meetings to decide who to kill with drones, knowing that other people would be killed too in those drone strikes, they would, I guess, use the discourse of the lesser evil to make the act of killing feel like a philosophy seminar.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
So first of all, I'm actually Indonesian. I come from Indonesia, and I would like to thank you for these two films, The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence, because I've never had the experience to learn about my country's history, especially about the killings of 1965, throughout my school years, so having to watch your films is very eye-opening for me to know that unconsciously I am also bearing the responsibility of the narrative of the history of my country. And perhaps you also know that I think it's tomorrow, the 30th of September, that there will be the screening of, no, not screening, but the showing of the G30 PKI film. And I think this is the question that I've been asking myself for quite some time after watching your film, but perhaps you can give an advice, what can I do as a part of the younger generation to fight this kind of to show that, oh, we also wanted to learn this other part of history. I don't know if that's something that you can answer, but that's the question that I've been asking myself, how can I take part in this?
Awesome.
Thank you.
Sama-sama. Thank you for telling me that and asking me. And I'm so glad that the films have reached you. Tomorrow is indeed the 52nd anniversary of the start of the genocide, and there will be official screening. Part of it, I mentioned this commander of the army, Indonesian Armed Forces commander's order to curb screenings of my films. And one of the ways they propose to do that is by holding official screenings of the government propaganda film again, after it not having been screened officially for many, many years. It's backfired because the government propaganda film is terribly dated and boring, and everyone sort of knows it's a lie. And then he's also said that this is to prevent people from watching The Look of Silence, and that's just generated, as I mentioned earlier, interest in these films. I think there's a couple things. First of all, to answer your question, first of all, I think it's so important to understand as a young Indonesian and as a human being anywhere why in a country where communism has simply not existed for 52 years. It's one of the only countries where communism never seems to die, where those in power keep the fear of communism alive. What are they really doing? I think they're doing two things. I think they're intimidating survivors into silence, and they're speaking in an encoded way that I discussed earlier. They're reminding the public of what they can do if provoked. And I think it's basically a system of intimidation to discourage people from coming together in democratic, political, active ways to hold their leaders to account. And I think the sad truth is they are capable of violence, but they're also in many ways pretty incompetent, and there's a lot of infighting among the leaders. And when I say not holding the leaders to account, I mean Indonesia is still, although as much as you as a young Indonesian want to say, may wish to believe Indonesia is a democracy, it is not. And it is legally not a democracy, because although there are regular elections, if a military commander in Indonesia, if an army general, this event were happening in Indonesia, and an army general went in and had ordered everybody in the room to be killed, in Indonesian law today, he cannot be held accountable. He cannot be put on trial in a court for murder. The only way that he could be punished is if the Indonesian army itself decided to court-martial him. That is to say, the army would have to punish itself, which means formally in Indonesia today, legally, the army is above the law. And when you have the army above the law, because the army has the greatest capacity for violence in the country, it is the law. Which is why Jokowi's made so many promises, but then his own right-wing army-affiliated ministers who he relies on for support too, when they say we're never going to do that, whether it's his Minister of Defense or his security minister saying absolutely not, we're never going to really investigate the mass graves that Jokowi, the president, called his government to investigate. Jokowi caves in every single time. And it's not simply because he's a wimp or he's compromising, it's because actually he's not the commander-in-chief. He's beneath the military still. And so the military, oligarchs partner with the military, and in turn they hire paramilitary groups like Pancasila Youth or from Bela Islam to intimidate people who would protest the plunder of your country. And that's a really big enemy you have to stand up against. And there are groups, anti-corruption groups, there's human rights groups that do stand up, environmental groups that do stand up. And one thing you can do is join those. And secondly, there's a kind of movement, whether or not there will ever be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether or not there will ever be justice. I think that a national reckoning is underway, in the sense that there's a generation like of people like you, who are asking, as I mentioned earlier, who am I? And to know who I am, who's my family, where do I come from? Where have I been lied to? If my parents lied to me or sat by while I was lied to by my teachers, why? What were they afraid of? And there's people sharing stories, and they're sharing them around screenings of these films. They're sharing them through things like the International People's Tribunal, which Indonesian activists put together for the 1965 killings. They're sharing them through websites like Ingat 65, Ingat 65, where people are gathering stories. It means remember 65. Asking their parents and grandparents stories, holding screenings of the films, telling their friends about the films. Both films are available online, so ask your parents, ask your grandparents. Challenge them if you think they're lying, if you feel comfortable to, but gently ask them why they're afraid of the truth. It's something Germany went through in the 60s and 70s, and it's made Germany, I think, despite the terrible development that there's now a far-right party in Bundestag, it's made Germany the most successful country that's ever, I think, that I know of in terms of dealing with its past. And I think the process of national reckoning, of you asking and sharing, asking your parents' stories, asking your neighbors' stories, and sharing those stories, I think that's unstoppable.
Hello, Mr. Oppenheimer. I really appreciate that you could share so many experiences with us. My question is, besides the point that you mentioned that you see film as a metaphysical form, I'm really interested in the way that you use the film, you use the camera, in fact, as a way of interaction. It reminds me a little bit on John Roche, but it's a little bit different. I see that it's interesting because the people, they find actually, they had a lot of imagination what a film should be like and what they should look like as an actor. And but until they really take act performance, they find the truth of themselves. And I'm asking if you could share some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, I think that actually much of what I said about inviting people to stage themselves and reflect on their image are sort of, you're absolutely right, are standing on our developments in Jean Rouche's methods. And in a sense, especially Jean Rouche's sort of ethno-fictions, what he called ethno-fictions, films like Moine, Noir, Jaguar, Petit à Petit, these are films where he created ways, he allowed people, he did kind of very simple versions of what I was trying to do, what I ultimately was able to do. And I think one reason his methods were simpler was because he was shooting on celluloid. And you would need, you mentioned earlier, you alluded to how much footage I shot. It was 1,200 hours for the act of killing. You need like an airplane hangar to hold 1,200 hours of celluloid. So I think that, I'm not sure I answered your question, but yes, absolutely, I'm standing on the shoulders of Jean Rouche.
No, not just about Jean Rouche, I just mentioned that. I just want to ask the film as a form of intervention, and maybe for the meaning for a person, that the person used to then just find himself and maybe change his ideas just through.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry I missed that. No, absolutely. I'm sorry, and I'm glad you asked, you followed up. I think that, I'll tie this into what I said about Jean Rouche, because Jean Rouche coined the term cinema verite, and that term has been stolen, really, by practitioners of what you can call direct, also call correctly direct cinema, or people who do observational cinema, where they basically create a simulation of this thing I talked about earlier, simulating life as if there's no camera present. Jean Rouche understood that whenever the camera's there, it is an intervention. And I just would build on his notion of cinema verite to say what I think all documentary really is when it's good, including actually the masterpieces, because there are some masterpieces of direct cinema, or this sort of simple observational cinema. And I would say it's this. I work closely with my participants. It's a filmmaker who works closely with her participants to create an occasion together with them, where you collaborate together with them to create an occasion where something invisible, normally invisible, is made visible, and usually if whatever is being made invisible is important, it's invisible for a reason. It's something people have trouble looking at. So everybody in such a process is inevitably pushed beyond their comfort zone, and yet, if you're going to film with people more than one day, that's always within the safe space of making a film. Otherwise, people won't come back for the next day of shooting. But I think in that sense, it's always an intervention, and it's making a film, and it's always it always transforms. If it's an honest film, it's not just the participants who are pushed beyond their comfort zone, it's the filmmaker too, who has to sort of work compassionately and look in the eyes of, in a kind of exchange, the participants. And in that sense, it's both an intervention, which by making things that were previously invisible visible, transforms the nature of the reality for both the participants and the filmmaker, and the shared reality that you're creating, which means the next day you can't just do another scene like the previous day, because the reality has changed. And any film that, and inevitably when you're pushing people beyond the comfort zone and yourself beyond the comfort zone, changing reality, the character's journey in such a film is the one created by the filmmaking. And in that sense, because it's the filmmaking itself that's pushing people to see new things by creating these occasions. And in that sense, any film which whenever you make a film, a documentary film especially, you ask how are the characters changing, where are they changing, and that's your story. And you've either simulated a change, in the way I described earlier, by filming scenes where people pretend to be going about their lives and simulating a change, or they really change. And if you let that take over and become the film's narrative, then not only is any film an intervention, but it's also reflexive, because it's always about, whether it acknowledges it or not, it's always about itself. It's always about the intervention. It's always following that intervention and its successive consequences for the participants.
Okay, there's one more question. I think one last question, because we've talked for almost 2 hours.
Yeah, watching the act of killing, even though those people did horrible things, at some points it felt really good to see them admit what they did and admit guilt, and showing even like traces of admitting to lying to some certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
And that being said, watching The Look of Silence felt really horrible at some points, because I couldn't recognize that side of the perpetrators. So I couldn't recognize them admitting to lying or admitting weaknesses, and I just wanted to know if you expected that or if that was intended by you. Like, because they just built up a wall, and of course you spent far less time with those people, but still I hope to see like at least a glimpse of it.
I expected, as I think I said earlier, you recall I said to Adi that I expected that the confrontations would fail, that he wouldn't get the expressions of remorse, the apology that he hoped for. And in that sense, I knew that, having made the act of killing, I knew there's no way that this situation would feel like a safe space. Having just talked about safe spaces in my previous answer, it wouldn't feel like a safe space where someone could explore their guilt. I think we see the guilt. It's in the panic, it's in the anger, it's in the defensiveness. We have this moment of grace that I touched on earlier, where the daughter actually apologizes on behalf of her father, even though she didn't do anything wrong. She doesn't have to apologize. She said, I'm sorry. I think in that sense, I knew that The Look of Silence would, it's also worth sort of talking about this in terms of how the films came out in Indonesia. The act of killing sort of exploded on the scene in all of its lurid and obscene kind of grotesquerie, and forced people to acknowledge that what happened was a crime against humanity, and that the perpetrators had been in power and run a corrupt society ever since. And then 2 years later, into the space that the act of killing opened, through thousands of screenings and millions of downloads of the film and thousands of articles in the press, came the second film, this time distributed by the National Human Rights Commission of Indonesia, which is part of the government, even though the military would then later ban the film. In came the second film saying, and look at the abyss of fear and guilt that's dividing everybody in this society. Look at how torn, as I said earlier, the society is, and how urgently truth, justice, and reconciliation are needed. And in that sense, the film, The Act of Killing, kind of has a happy ending. It's the darkest happy ending in film, but it's a happy ending in that at least we see that someone who's as depraved and venal as Anwar still has a residue of humanity in him that chokes on what he did and is haunted. And therefore there ought to be a way that we can come together as a species and prevent people from doing this to one another, because there's actually no monsters among us, there's just human beings. And it's hopeful that the way to prevent these things doesn't involve identifying the monsters and killing them, because we'd be monsters ourselves if we do that. Luckily, everyone who does this is a human being. So I think people who are willing to identify with Anwar just enough that they can recognize the authenticity of his guilt, his feeling of guilt, they find it hopeful in some way. I think there's other people who are so repulsed by the idea, so provoked by the idea of being asked to approach a character like Anwar through my intimacy with him and to identify something of themselves in Anwar, they just say that Anwar's faking it, that he's not really feeling anything on the roof, that it's all acted, it's all staged. And I think that reaction is simply a defense because people find it, have rejected the central premise of the film, that here's a human being, and let's get close to him and see how he lives with himself. And so, of course, that's a hopeful ending, and The Look of Silence deliberately ends with especially a challenge to Indonesians, and which is, look, there's a mess here. That's why the film ends in that horrible mess with the two sons of Amir Hassan get so angry and kick us out of the house. That is an unhappy ending. I discovered the importance of compassion in the act of killing, and the potential for this kind of dark, happy ending only through making the film, only through the editing. Sorry, to answer the earlier question about editing. I could have seen, and I still see, I think there's a way of seeing, to answer the much earlier question about the obscene, there's a way of looking at Anwar choking on the roof as also the obscene coming back and gagging him, nauseating him. And he embodies the rottenness of this whole society there. And the director's cut of the film, the longer cut of the film, is carefully edited so that he sort of does, every time we encounter his guilt or his empathy, we've also encountered, it's been put in, we cut to like paramilitary leaders, or we cut to politicians, so that he sort of becomes a vessel, and particularly his relationship with Herman is edited to be a vessel for also the whole society. And there's a way of looking at his choking as a kind of indictment of the rottenness of this regime. But it ultimately, that's one layer in it. And it was only through the editing that I saw this actually is a hopeful ending in a very, very, very dark way. And it was, but I knew from the beginning of the shooting that the other film had a dark message, because the other film, The Look of Silence, was a response to the terrible condition that motivated me to take this 12-year journey, which was that or 11-year journey, which was that the survivors were living in silence and in fear, and were being killed by fear, going back to those plantation workers. They were dying because of fear, while the perpetrators were lording their crimes over them boastfully. And how can an expose of that, and the experience of those survivors, be anything other than dark?
Okay, I would like to thank you now very much for sharing your ideas, your feelings about the world, and all the insights you gave to your work and the process. I think for me it was really super interesting. I hope it was interesting for the rest of us too. Anything you would like to say?
Thank you very much. Perhaps I have a last question.
Okay. I was afraid.
A very usual question, but is there a way you can talk about your current plans?
Well, I have two projects, and one of them I cannot talk about, but one of them I certainly can. I'm in the middle of revising a screenplay for my first fiction film, which is a musical. It's The Act of Killing is a musical too, so don't expect La La Land, but it's a musical. It's called The End. It takes place it's about a very, very wealthy family holed up in a bunker, a very luxurious bunker, after the world has ended, and the music is pure, glorious Rodgers and Hammerstein style optimistic delusion.
Sounds great.
Inspired, yeah, that's what I'm working on right now.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much for talking to us. And we are very much looking forward to your future projects, and also the archive in Indonesia, when it will be available for us all to share, and your work goes on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Ja, vielen Dank. song.